November 13th, 1941. Mediterranean Sea, HMS Ark Royal, Britain's most celebrated aircraft carrier, has just taken a torpedo from U-81. Water floods her engine rooms at catastrophic speed. In the chaos below decks, a 19-year-old stoker named Bert Mitchell from Liverpool stands waist-deep in seawater, staring at a breach the size of a dustbin lid. Every pump aboard is failing. Every conventional damage control method has been tried. The carrier is listing 18 degrees. Bert looks at the empty coal sacks stacked against the bulkhead, remnants from the ship's earlier coal-burning days, and has an idea so absurd his mates will later call it DAFT. But in the next 6 hours, that daft idea will become the difference between 1 through 500 men reaching Gibraltar alive or joining Ark Royal on the seabed. HMS Ark Royal had been the Royal Navy's untouchable legend since 1938. The 22,000-ton aircraft carrier had survived more death sentences than any warship afloat. German radio had sunk her at least 5 times in propaganda broadcasts. Lord Haw-Haw's smug voice declaring her destruction had become a running joke among her crew of 600 men. They'd painted "Still Here" on her funnel after the 3rd false report. She'd hunted the Bismarck, escorted convoys through U-boat-infested waters, launched strikes against Italian naval bases, and operated continuously in the most dangerous theater of war, the Mediterranean. Her swordfish torpedo bombers had crippled the Italian fleet at Taranto. Her presence alone forced Axis naval commanders to rethink operations. She was more than steel and rivets. She was British defiance made manifest. But on November 13th, 1941, 30 miles east of Gibraltar, that defiance met cold physics. At 15:41 hours, Lieutenant Friedrich Guggenberger aboard U-81 fired a single torpedo from 1,000 yards. The G7E torpedo, running at 30 knots, struck Ark Royal's starboard side amidships just below the waterline. The explosion tore a 130-foot gash along her hull, rupturing fuel tanks, flooding boiler rooms, and severing electrical cables. The carrier shuddered like a wounded animal. Alarms screamed. The deck tilted. Men stumbled. Within 3 minutes, she'd taken on 3,000 tons of seawater and developed an 18-degree list to starboard. Below decks, in the starboard boiler room, 19-year-old Stoker First Class Albert Mitchell was thrown against a bulkhead by the blast. The lights went out. Emergency lamps flickered on, casting red shadows. Water roared through the breach with the sound of a collapsing dam. Bert's ears rang. His lungs burned from the acrid smoke. Around him, men shouted coordinates, damage assessments, casualty reports. The deck was tilting beneath his feet at an angle that defied balance. He grabbed a stanchion to steady himself, salt water already up to his knees. Bert had joined the Navy 18 months earlier from Liverpool's docklands, where his father had worked as a coal handler for Cunard. The Mitchells weren't naval family. His dad shifted cargo. His mum cleaned offices near Lime Street Station. But when war came, Bert had walked into the recruiting office on his 18th birthday because staying home felt like cowardice. They'd assigned him to the Stoker branch, feeding coal into boilers that powered turbines that drove propellers that moved warships. It was brutal work. 12-hour shifts in 120-degree heat, shoveling coal until your back screamed and your hands bled through gloves. But it was necessary work. Ark Royal's 4 Parsons turbines could push her to 31 knots. Those turbines needed steam. Steam needed fire. Fire needed coal. Coal needed stokers. Now, standing in rising water with the ship listing like a dying whale, Bert watched senior ratings attempt standard damage control. Chief Petty Officer Davies directed men with wooden shores, vertical beams wedged between deck and overhead to reinforce weakened bulkheads. Others deployed collision mats, canvas sheets lowered over the hull's exterior to cover breaches. Pumps roared, trying to evacuate water faster than it entered, but the torpedo had done catastrophic damage. The main breach was below the waterline in a location impossible to access from outside. Interior bulkheads were buckling. Pumps were losing the battle. For every ton they evacuated, 3 entered. The mathematics were brutal. At current flooding rate, Ark Royal would capsize within 4 hours. Lieutenant Commander Evans, the damage control officer, stood knee-deep in water, shouting orders through the noise. "Shore up that bulkhead. Get more pumps down here. Route emergency power from the auxiliary generators." His voice carried the brittle edge of desperation, barely controlled. Evans was a Cambridge graduate, son of a vice admiral, trained at Dartmouth. Everything in his education told him this was manageable. But education doesn't account for an 18-degree list, severed power lines, and a breach the size of a Morris Minor below the waterline. Bert and 3 other stokers, Tommy Price from Cardiff, Jimmy Sullivan from Glasgow, and Harry Webb from Manchester, worked a manual pump in the corner, operating the handle in exhausting rotation. Tommy, built like a rugby forward, grunted with each stroke. "This is bloody useless, lads. We're pissing into the ocean." Jimmy, thin and wiry, shot back with dark humour. "Aye, but at least we're pissing organised. Navy tradition, that." Harry, normally the quiet one, just pumped harder, jaw set. The water kept rising. Ankles, then shins, then knees, then thighs. Equipment floated past. Toolboxes, life jackets, someone's cap with HMS Ark Royal embroidered in gold thread. The smell was overwhelming. Fuel oil, seawater, burnt insulation, human sweat. The temperature dropped as cold Atlantic water displaced the tropical heat they'd been working in. Men's teeth chattered. Hypothermia was now a threat alongside drowning. At 16:15, 34 minutes after the torpedo strike, Captain Maund gave the order to abandon ship. Tannoys crackled. "All hands, abandon ship. Proceed to muster stations. This is not a drill. Abandon ship." The words hit like a second explosion. Ark Royal, unsinkable, legendary, still here, was being abandoned. Men scrambled toward ladders. The list made climbing hellish. What should have been vertical was now a steep slope. Hands slipped on wet metal. Boots skidded. Panic edged into voices. But Bert didn't move toward the ladders. He stood in chest-deep water, staring at the breach visible through the flooded compartment. Seawater poured through with relentless force, a horizontal river that couldn't be stopped. He watched Lieutenant Commander Evans directing the evacuation, professional to the end, making sure every man accounted for. He watched Chief Davies helping a younger rating toward the ladder, shouting encouragement. He watched his mates, Tommy, Jimmy, Harry, looking at him with questions in their eyes. "You coming, Bert?" Tommy shouted over the roar. Bert looked at the empty coal sacks stacked against the far bulkhead. Ark Royal had been converted from coal to oil fuel years ago, but old coal sacks remained in storage, thick canvas bags that once held hundredweights of Welsh anthracite. They'd been used for everything from sandbags to laundry bags. Now they sat there, sodden and forgotten, stacked 20 high against the bulkhead. An absurd idea formed, ridiculous, impossible, daft, but it was something. "Go on without me," Bert said quietly. "I've got an idea." The evacuation continued above. Destroyers HMS Legion and HMS Lafaurie pulled alongside, their crews shouting encouragement as Ark Royal's men descended rope ladders and scrambled across gangplanks. The carrier's list had worsened to 27 degrees. Her flight deck, normally flat as a Norfolk field, now resembled a ski slope. Aircraft that hadn't been secured slid into the ocean with expensive splashes. The Mediterranean sun hung low, casting long shadows. Gibraltar was tantalizingly close, 30 miles. So close they could see the rock's limestone face, catching golden light. But 30 miles might as well be 300 if the ship capsized first. Below, in the flooded boiler room, Bert Mitchell remained with 5 volunteers who'd refused to abandon ship. Tommy Price, Jimmy Sullivan, Harry Webb, Stoker second-class Dennis O'Neill from Dublin, and leading stoker Frank Meadows, a 35-year-old veteran from Portsmouth. Frank had served since 1925, survived the Depression by staying Navy, earned his leading rate through sheer competence. When Bert explained his plan, using coal sacks filled with whatever materials they could find to build a dam against the breach, Frank had laughed. Not mockery, recognition. "My granddad did something similar on a collier in 1902, Frank said. "Stuffed canvas with oakum and rope. Madness, but it worked long enough." That was enough endorsement. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. They'd fill coal sacks with debris, wood fragments, cork, canvas, rope, oil-soaked rags, anything that could absorb water and create bulk. Stack the filled sacks against the breach, pack them tight. Let water pressure itself compress the dam. The sacks would swell as materials absorbed seawater, creating an increasingly tight seal. It wouldn't stop the leak entirely, nothing could, but it might reduce the inflow enough for the remaining pumps to cope. Might buy enough time to reach Gibraltar. Might. The reality was exhausting beyond description. The water was chest deep now and rising. The temperature had dropped to perhaps 10 degrees Celsius, cold enough for hypothermia to set in within an hour. Every movement was like wading through treacle. The list meant the deck was tilted at an angle that made standing without bracing impossible. Emergency lighting flickered erratically, casting everything in hellish red. The roar of water pouring through the breach was constant, maddening, and they were working against time. Captain Maund had agreed to delay full evacuation for 2 hours to give them a chance, but no longer. They started gathering materials. Tommy and Harry broke apart wooden shores that had failed, splintering them into manageable pieces. Jimmy collected rope from damaged rigging, coiling it into tight bundles. Dennis found cork life preservers and tore them open, scattering chunks. Frank located oil-soaked cleaning rags from a storage locker. Bert coordinated, shouting instructions that barely carried over the noise. His engineering instinct, inherited from watching his father load ships with precise weight distribution, guided placement. The dam needed to be built from the bottom up, each layer compressed by the weight of the next, the whole structure wedged between deck and overhead. The first coal sack was filled with wood fragments and rope, tied shut and dragged toward the breach. Moving it through chest-deep water required 3 men. The current from the inflow tried to push them back. They leaned into it, muscles screaming. When they reached the breach, they shoved the sack against the opening. Water pressure immediately pinned it there, but also found gaps around it, continuing to pour through. They needed more, many more. They filled a second sack, a third, a fourth. Each one was wrestled into position, stacked atop or beside the previous one. The work was mechanically repetitive, but never routine. Every sack weighed perhaps 50 pounds dry, closer to 90 pounds wet. The men were already exhausted from hours of emergency pumping. Now they were working in freezing water on a tilted deck with hypothermia creeping into their limbs. Fingers went numb, teeth chattered uncontrollably, speech became slurred. At 17:30, an hour into the effort, they'd placed 12 sacks. The inflow had reduced by perhaps 15%, noticeable but nowhere near enough. The water level had stabilized at chest height instead of rising to neck height, which meant the pumps were just barely keeping pace. That was something. But they needed more. Frank Meadows, oldest among them, started showing signs of hypothermia. His movements became sluggish, his speech slowed. Bert ordered him to rest against the bulkhead, but Frank refused. "I'm not leaving you lads to do this alone. My granddad would haunt me." He kept working, though his hands shook violently. Above, on the flight deck, Captain Maund received updates from Lieutenant Commander Evans, who'd stayed aboard to coordinate damage control. "Sir, the flooding in the starboard boiler room has slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. Mitchell and his team have created some kind of dam out of coal sacks." Maund, a career officer with 28 years' service, had seen many things. This was new. "How long can they maintain it?" Evans shook his head. "Unknown, sir, but they've bought us time. If they can hold another hour, we might make Gibraltar before she capsizes." Below, the work continued. 13th sack, 14th, 15th. The men developed a rhythm born of desperate necessity. Fill, drag, place, repeat. Fill, drag, place, repeat. No conversation now. All energy went to movement. The water was winning the battle against body temperature. Bert could no longer feel his feet. His hands were clumsy, dropping things. But stopping meant drowning. Drowning meant failure. Failure meant 2,500 men swimming in the Mediterranean, hoping destroyers could fish them out before exposure or sharks finished them. At 18 news, the sun set. Darkness fell across the Mediterranean like a curtain. Emergency lighting inside the ship became their only illumination. The red lamps cast grotesque shadows. Everything looked like a scene from hell. But the dam was working. 23 sacks now, tightly packed, compressed by water pressure, swollen with absorbed seawater. The inflow had reduced by an estimated 40%. The pumps, 3 still operational out of 12, were holding the water level steady at chest height. Steady meant survivable. Survivable meant possible. Tommy Price, usually jovial, worked with tears freezing on his cheeks, not from pain, though pain was universal, from something else. "My mum's in Cardiff," he said to no one in particular. "Bombs hit her street last month. She's all right, but the house is gone. She's living with my aunt. I told her I'd come home safe. Can't let her down." No one answered. There was nothing to say. Friedrich Guggenberger aboard U-81 had surfaced after nightfall to observe his victory. Through the periscope, he'd watched Ark Royal list catastrophically, watched destroyers cluster around her like mourners at a funeral, watched the evacuation begin. He'd reported back to Kriegsmarine headquarters in Berlin. Aircraft carrier Ark Royal struck amidships, torpedo confirmed, flooding observed, list approximately 30 degrees, vessel believed lost, recommend confirmation. Berlin was ecstatic. Ark Royal, the ship German propaganda had sunk 5 times, only to have her reappear like a ghost, was finally truly finished. Goering himself sent congratulations. Medals would be forthcoming. But something wasn't right. Guggenberger watched through darkness as Ark Royal refused to capsize. The list had stabilized. The destroyers weren't circling a sinking wreck. They were maintaining formation as though escorting, as though the carrier was still moving. Impossible. No ship takes a torpedo of that size, develops that list and remains operational. The flooding alone should have dragged her under by now. British damage control was competent, certainly, but this defied engineering reality. At Kriegsmarine headquarters in Wilhelmshaven, intelligence officers debated the reports. Guggenberger confirms torpedo strike. British radio confirms Ark Royal damaged. But Gibraltar Harbour Watch reports no sinking. What are we missing? A senior analyst suggested British propaganda, claiming the ship still floated to maintain morale. But operational reports contradicted this. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted Ark Royal at dawn, still afloat, under tow by tugs, destroyers surrounding her. Listing badly, certainly. Dead in the water, yes, but not sunk, not capsized, still there. The confusion stemmed from doctrinal assumptions. German naval engineering emphasized compartmentalization and automated systems. Damage control relied on watertight doors, pumps controlled from central stations, procedures executed by specialists. It was systematic, hierarchical, efficient when everything worked as designed, but it didn't account for improvisation by ordinary ratings. It didn't account for a 19-year-old Stoker from Liverpool deciding that coal sacks and debris could substitute for engineered solutions. The Kriegsmarine couldn't comprehend that Ark Royal's survival depended on 6 frozen, exhausted men building a dam out of rubbish in a flooded compartment. Aboard Ark Royal, Captain Maund made a decision that defied procedure. Standard protocol demanded full evacuation of a listing carrier. Once the crew was off, the ship became expendable. But Lieutenant Commander Evans reported that Mitchell's dam was holding, water ingress had stabilized, pumps were coping, the carrier wasn't sinking, she was wounded but controllable. At 19:30, 4 hours after the torpedo strike, Maund ordered partial reboarding. 50 essential crew returned via destroyer transfer, engineers, electricians, damage control ratings, officers. Their mission, keep pumps running, maintain the dam, and prepare tow lines for Gibraltar harbour tugs. The reboarding occurred in darkness across gangplanks connecting destroyer to listing carrier. Men climbed at precarious angles, the carrier's deck tilted like a funhouse floor. The sea was calm, mercifully. Even small swells would have made transfer impossible. They descended into the ship's interior, following dim emergency lights, the smell of fuel oil and seawater overwhelming. Everything was tilted. Walking required bracing against bulkheads. Objects rolled unpredictably. It was disorienting, nauseating. In the boiler room, Bert and his team had been working for nearly 5 hours. They'd placed 37 sacks. The dam now extended from deck to overhead, packed so tightly that water barely trickled through gaps. The inflow had reduced by an estimated 70%. The pumps, now supplemented by portable pumps brought by the reboarding party, were actually lowering the water level, from chest deep to waist deep, from waist deep to thigh deep. Progress. Tangible, measurable progress. When Lieutenant Commander Evans climbed down into the compartment and saw what they'd accomplished, he stood speechless for several seconds. 6 men, blue with cold, shaking uncontrollably, clinging to consciousness through sheer will, had done what engineering manuals said couldn't be done. They'd stopped a catastrophic leak using nothing but old canvas and debris. Evans, trained at Britannia Royal Naval College, son of wealth and privilege, recognized genius when he saw it, even genius born of desperation in Liverpool docklands. "Stoker Mitchell," Evans said formally, though his voice cracked with emotion. "You and your men have saved this ship. I'm recommending commendations for all of you." Bert, teeth chattering too violently for speech, just nodded. Tommy managed a weak grin. "Does that come with a tot of rum, sir? Because I'm bloody frozen." At midnight, Gibraltar Harbour tugs made contact. Ark Royal, still listing 27 degrees but no longer sinking, was taken under tow. The journey to harbour was agonizingly slow, 2 knots, barely faster than walking. The dam held, the pumps continued. The men rotated shifts, warming up before returning to cold water. By 06:00 on November 14th, Ark Royal entered Gibraltar Harbour. Cheers erupted from destroyers, shore batteries, watching crowds. She hadn't sunk. Against all probability, she'd survived, but the battle wasn't over. The list was too severe for harbour pumps to overcome. At 06:13, as dawn broke over Gibraltar's limestone cliffs, Ark Royal's list suddenly increased. The dam failed. Water rushed in. In minutes, the list reached 45 degrees. At 06:19, HMS Ark Royal capsized and sank in shallow water just inside Gibraltar Harbour. But by then, every single member of her crew, all 1,600 men, was safely ashore. Not one life lost. The coal sack dam hadn't saved the ship, but it had saved the men, and that's what mattered. The loss of HMS Ark Royal was headline news across Britain. Newspapers ran images of her capsized hull in Gibraltar Harbour. Churchill himself addressed Parliament, praising the crew's heroism and lamenting the loss of such a valuable asset. But within Admiralty circles, a different conversation was happening. How had a torpedoed carrier listing 30 degrees, flooding catastrophically, remained afloat for 14 hours? How had evacuation proceeded without a single casualty? The answer, when investigated, was both humbling and revolutionary. The Board of Inquiry convened in Gibraltar interviewed every officer and rating involved. When they reached Bert Mitchell and his 5 companions, the story emerged. A 19-year-old stoker with no engineering training, using materials that would normally be discarded, had improvised a damage control solution that wasn't in any manual. The inquiry's report, classified but later made public, stated, "The actions of Stoker First Class Mitchell and his team demonstrated initiative and resourcefulness of the highest order. Their improvised dam, constructed from coal sacks and debris, reduced water ingress by an estimated 70%, providing sufficient time for controlled evacuation. This action directly resulted in 0 casualties, despite catastrophic damage. The broader implications transformed Royal Navy damage control doctrine. Before Ark Royal, Damage control was considered a specialist function, trained teams using approved equipment following established procedures. After Ark Royal, the Admiralty recognized that survival often depended on improvisation by ordinary ratings. New training programs were developed, emphasizing creative problem-solving under pressure. Coal sacks, and later modern equivalents, were officially added to damage control inventories. The Mitchell Dam became a taught technique, refined and standardized, but still fundamentally the same. Use absorbent materials packed tightly to reduce breaches below the waterline. Albert Mitchell returned to Liverpool in 1942 after completing his service. He received the Distinguished Service Medal for gallantry and resourcefulness in the face of enemy action. The medal came with a certificate signed by King George VI. Bert kept it in a drawer and rarely spoke about it. He returned to the docks where his father worked, eventually becoming a foreman at Gladstone Dock. He married a girl from Bootle named Margaret in 1943. They had 3 children. He lived a quiet life, punctuated by nightmares about cold water and listing decks. But every November 13th, on the anniversary of Ark Royal's torpedoing, Bert would receive letters. From Tommy Price in Cardiff, who'd become a builder and helped reconstruct bomb-damaged homes. From Jimmy Sullivan in Glasgow, who'd joined the Merchant Navy after the war and sailed until his 60s. From Harry Webb in Manchester, who'd worked in engineering at Rolls-Royce. From Dennis O'Neill in Dublin, who'd become a teacher. From Frank Meadows' widow in Portsmouth, after Frank passed away in 1967, Frank had spoken about the lads and the sacks until his final days. The letters were brief, sentimental, written by men who weren't natural writers, but they all said the same thing: still here, thanks to you, thanks to all of us. The 5 men who'd stayed with Bert that day never sought recognition. They didn't write memoirs or give interviews. They were, in the British tradition, quietly proud but publicly modest. What they'd done was simply what needed doing. The fact that it worked was fortune. The fact that they'd tried was duty. But historians recognize something profound. Ark Royal's survival for those crucial 14 hours wasn't a fluke. It was evidence of a quality that defined British resistance throughout the war. The ability of ordinary people to respond extraordinarily when crisis demanded it. The Blitz hadn't broken London because civilians kept going. Factories kept producing aircraft despite bombing because workers refused to stop. Convoys kept sailing despite U-boats because merchant seamen wouldn't quit. And Ark Royal hadn't immediately sunk because a stoker from Liverpool looked at a breach and thought, I can do something about that. The Royal Navy learned that survival wasn't just about superior technology or rigid procedures. It was about empowering the lowest ranks to make decisions, to improvise, to try things that sounded daft but might work. Other navies, German, Japanese, Italian, maintained strict hierarchies where initiative from below was discouraged. The Royal Navy, shaped by centuries of sea-going pragmatism, recognized that the able seaman with the wrench might have a better solution than the admiral with the blueprint. Bert Mitchell died in 1983, aged 61, from lung problems related to decades of shipyard work. His funeral in Liverpool was attended by hundreds, family, dock workers, former Navy mates. A representative from the Admiralty attended, reading a letter. Stoker First Class Albert Mitchell exemplified the finest traditions of the Royal Navy. His courage and resourcefulness under extreme conditions saved 1,600 lives and demonstrated that heroism requires neither rank nor recognition, only the willingness to act when action is necessary. The Coal Sack Dam became part of naval legend. Training instructors at Britannia Royal Naval College still tell the story. In November 1941, a teenager from Liverpool saved an aircraft carrier using rubbish and initiative. The lesson isn't about coal sacks. It's about thinking when procedures fail. It's about trying when everyone else has given up. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone has to. HMS Ark Royal lies in shallow water off Gibraltar. Her wreck a war grave protected by law. Divers occasionally visit, reporting that portions of her structure remain intact despite decades underwater. The boiler room where Bert's dam was built is collapsed, filled with silt. But the story survives. The lesson endures. When systems fail, when procedures don't cover the situation, when engineering solutions aren't available, that's when human creativity, courage, and sheer bloody-minded determination matter most. That's when the DAFT idea becomes the difference between survival and disaster. That's when a 19-year-old stoker with coal sacks becomes more valuable than all the admirals in Whitehall. And that's why, 70 years later, the Royal Navy still teaches damage control teams about the Liverpool lad who looked at a catastrophic breach and said, "I've got an idea." If you found this story of British ingenuity and courage compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more forgotten tales from the Second World War. We uncover the stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. The unsung heroes whose names don't appear in history books but whose actions changed the course of the war. Leave a comment below. What other lesser-known WW2 stories would you like us to explore? Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the famous, it's about the brave.